Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we have some interesting updates. We start out in the south where the Russians have secured further positions southwest of Prechestivka, indicating their push further west from Prechestivka and securing their positions within the town by securing the forest lines and fields southwest of the town. You see, positional fighting continues both southwest of the town as well as in the near areas of it. The Russians have, with this geolocated footage, shown that they are at the western outskirts of the town, showing the full control of it, but whether their offensive has pushed to the north yet is unknown. So what we see is that the Russians have pushed further northwest of Novomayorsk, southwest of Prechestivka, in the direction of Zolotoneva. Other than that, the information of further offensive operations are unknown. Further north in the direction of the pocket here southeast of Karolivka, the area of the 2014 line of defense which the Russians recently captured, there are reports that the Ukrainians are withdrawing further beyond to the road here between Krasnoarivka and Zelena Pershe, likely to withdraw the Ukrainian soldiers from the remaining parts of the city towards the Vovche River line and beyond it. This is why they are moving to the edge of this road to prevent any sort of encirclement, limit the amount of soldiers they have to defend, and defend the roads they are using to withdraw. This means that the Russians will soon capture the next portion, after which they may attempt an operation to cut off this road northwest of Krasnoarivka, or to simply let the Ukrainians withdraw and hit them while they are withdrawing out of the city and out of this pocket entirely. Based on the current trend, with the lack of advancements by the Russians here west of the front line in the direction of Pokrovsk, and the additional advances taking place here to the south, it is likely that the Russians are focusing entirely on the southern flank to deal with the Ukrainian withdrawal and potentially gain as much as possible from this withdrawal at the same time as fighting takes place in Selidove, which due to the fact that it has slowed down is likely due to Ukraine with reinforcements arriving to strengthen the defense. Likewise, the Ukrainians have sent reinforcements to cover for the retreat of the Ukrainians out of the pocket. This could also simply be units retrieving out of the pocket to strengthen the defense in the southern parts and additional reinforcements from the northwestern parts. In either case, the Ukrainians are here trying to stabilize the situation and potentially even counterattack to prevent a collapse of this section of the front line. However, the parts of Krasnoarivka, the pocket in between, has collapsed, and this is what has forced the withdrawal of the Ukrainians out of the pocket to prevent an encirclement and the Russians winning from that collapse, besides the territorial gains. The most important part is the soldiers which were within the pocket, because if the Ukrainians do not have anyone to defend the next line of defense, then that one will fall as well. But if they withdraw their troops, then they'll be able to defend the next line of defense, and they will have mitigated a bigger loss. Further north in the direction of New York, there have come out reports that the Ukrainians still are present within the industrial zone, the industrial plant here in the central parts of the city, and even that the Russians do not have full control over the roads and presence of the Ukrainians in the northern parts of New York. Until these reports are confirmed, I'm leaving this area as a gray zone, and it does seem reasonable that this is the case. The only case where the Russians got full control of the city that quickly would be if the Ukrainians withdrew from the city. But if this report is true, then the Ukrainians did not withdraw from the city. Instead, the Russians flanked them by getting their foothold within Nelipivka and using that to limit the supplies and prevent a withdrawal of the Ukrainians from the city, which means that instead of the Ukrainians withdrawing and as just as before, mitigating part of the loss by being able to defend the next line of defense by retreating with the soldiers, they are instead caught within the industrial area, and the Ukrainians are attempting to save them from this industrial area or encirclement, but they are facing heavy fighting, and the Russians are attempting to gain control of the area by starving them out and preventing their withdrawal and hitting back at any potential counterattacks by the Ukrainians. What this means is that this situation right now, if the Ukrainians still are present within the industrial zone is similar to that of Mariupol with the Azovstal steel plant, where the Russians have cut off the supplies and have cut off the retrieval route of the Ukrainians. This means they are now within a siege within the industrial zone here within New York, and this means that Ukrainian soldiers are encircled within it, which is actually a worse situation for both sides. If the Russians had full control due to the withdrawal of Ukrainian soldiers, that means that they could have developed their offensive operations further. However, this also supports the fact that the Ukrainians did not withdraw, which is that the Russians have not advanced further since the control over New York. This indicates that the Ukrainians really are present within the industrial zone. And how this is worse for the Ukrainians is if they do not successfully retrieve the soldiers out of the industrial zone, then they would have lost a significant amount of soldiers within it. And naturally, in war, any amount of soldiers lost is bad for whichever side loses them. Therefore, we see that the situation is difficult in New York, and I would have to apologize to Deep State Map for making too much fun of their mapping, because it may end up being true after all. In the north, the Deep State Map reports the Russian control over the eastern parts of the Druzhba, which means that the Russians now have full control over the village and have secured the northern flank of the Toretsk section, the Pivnitsha area. Generally, this strengthens the Russians' positions here in the north and allows them to concentrate more of their forces into the city itself or along the railways towards the next village. And this brings us to a very interesting development here further north, and that is a Russian push from Klishivka, which has reached the canal direction. And this is shown with this geolocated footage here. This means that the Russians, following their control over the fortified positions northwest of Klishivka, have made a push along the road towards the canal direction, where they've managed to capture the fortified positions in between and the first positions here along the eastern bank of the canal. Since then, they have developed offensive operations further along the road and along the canal, further south, where they are looking to gain full control of the fortified positions, which they have, and then pushed further south along the roads connecting Klishivka with their positions in the west. This means that the Russians will likely very soon gain full control over the eastern bank of the canal in the south, both in the direction of Andreevka and in the north between Klishivka and Ivanivske. With this, the Russians would very quickly be able to launch an offensive operation across the canal in the open fields here towards Bilahora, Delivka, Stupushki, and so on, similar to what the Wagner soldiers did back during the Battle of Bakhmut, where they can expand the front line here, and with the control over Druzhba in the south, will also allow them to expand their further offensive operations across the entirety of this section of the front line, in between Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. The developments here suggest that the Russians are expanding their frontline operations further, especially if the Ukrainians withdrew forces from other sections of the front line, whether Kherson, Zaporizhia, or even other sections of the Donetsk front to secure the front line by Pokrovsk. It would mean that other sections of the front line are weakened, and the Russians will take full advantage of that to expand their offensive operations. And if the Russians gain control over the final parts over Druzhba to then push on in the northern direction and combine that with an assault west of Klishivka, they could significantly expand the front line and take advantage of this relocation of troops to develop offensive operations further. Right now, the Ukrainians are focusing the majority of the defensive forces in the direction of Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and the Pokrovsk section of the front line, which are expending a lot of the Ukrainian resources and similarly a lot of the Russian resources. However, the Russians are now outnumbering the Ukrainians on the front line, which means that they can expend more forces than the Ukrainians can. At the same time, the Ukrainians are ongoing with their Kursk offensive, which has slowed down significantly considering the start of it, where they captured large portions of territory at a fast pace. Now they end up capturing portions on a couple of weeks that are similar to what they captured in a single day. And since then, we have seen some positional fighting with small advances, but none of it is significant enough to make much of an impact in the section of the front line, which indicates that it may have stalled and they may not achieve much more than they already have. Compared to that, the Russians are ongoing with offensive operations. If the Ukrainians have been able to stall the Russian Pokrovsk offensive, the Russians will simply move on to another section of the front line where they have been able to meet with more success until the Ukrainians are forced to withdraw their troops to other directions, after which they can restart their Pokrovsk offensive. So we see that right now the Ukrainians are on the move trying to stabilize the situation, while the Russians are simply hitting the Ukrainians any gap they find. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.